Hello and welcome to In Taiwan We Speak, your audio guide to Taiwan's mind-blowing linguistic diversity. I am Alexander Shin, and today in Taiwan we speak, or more like in Taiwan we sign languages. Taiwan is one of very few countries in Asia that granted official national language status to its main sign language, Taiwan Sign Language, or TSL. Now, I am joined today by Dr. Jean Andrews, Professor Emerita of Deaf Studies and Deaf Education at Lamar University in Texas, U.S. Dr. Andrews' scope of research includes not only the U.S. context, of course, but also Taiwan's deaf studies, and she is currently visiting Taiwan with a work mission. Dr. Andrews, thank you so much for coming here. It's a real pleasure having you here at Radio Taiwan International.
Thank you.
And I have to mention that Fan Huaigu, founder of the Signing Village Workshop, is in this room with us. Thank you, Fan Huai, for guiding Dr. Andrews to RTI today. And dear listeners, Fan Huai was previously a guest in our studio back in October 2024 when he shared with us about Taiwan's sign language and Taiwan's deaf community. So please do revisit that episode whenever you have time. It was an extremely insightful conversation. Now, Jean, this cannot be possibly your first time in Taiwan.
This is my third time here.
What's your impression visiting it for the third time now?
Well, each time I come, I collaborate with other researchers in deaf education projects. And after my first time coming in 2010, I established a relationship with faculty, and we've been publishing and presenting articles ever since. My second time I came to do some more workshops, particularly in the area of reading. That's my area of interest and expertise. And this third time I came to continue the collaboration.
I am a little bit sad that you didn't once mention that you're here for a vacation. I hope that opportunity will arise. Did you have a chance to also experience the culture, the food, maybe a little bit of that nature of Taiwan?
Oh, yes, of course. I would not come this long way and not go and see some sights. Sun Moon Lake, Sunlink Sea. Two of the times that I came with my husband, we rented a car and drove around the island. The different geography. We like beaches, so this was perfect coming to an island.
Well, I'm glad you had that opportunity as well. Now, before we begin, could you please share with our audience what's your relationship been with the sign language of the United States, the ASL as we call it, throughout your life? And what led you to become a scholar of deaf studies and deaf education?
My undergraduate school was in English literature with the idea of becoming a teacher. In my last undergraduate semester, I took a sign language class in American Sign Language at a nearby deaf university, Gallaudet. I became very interested in it, so I pursued a master's degree to become a teacher, not of sign language, but of deaf students. In that course, I realized that I had to become proficient in American Sign Language to work with deaf students. And then I taught young deaf children reading. And at that point, I realized that they're having great struggles. So I thought I better not stop my education. I better go get a doctor's degree in speech and hearing science and reading, which I did to learn research tools. Then I transitioned into working at universities in teacher prep programs. So I'm an educator of deaf students, a researcher in literacy, and ASL is a part of the big picture.
So you've had quite a journey with ASL. Would you say you're bilingual at this point?
Yes, I've been using it for over 50 years, so I would consider myself bilingual.
All right.
Probably better in my receptive than my expressive. My first class in deaf education, 1/3 of the students were deaf themselves. I learned to socialize with deaf friends, and so I learned ASL outside of the classroom mostly, and then also working with deaf colleagues at the university where I worked for almost 30 years. Half of our faculty were deaf, and so I had opportunities to collaborate with deaf people at the workplace.
Well, since our program focuses on languages spoken here in Taiwan, we often discuss the communities that use them. So in cases of most languages, these are, of course, diverse ethnic groups of Taiwan. From your research and experience, what can you tell us about the community that Taiwan's sign language represents, and how vibrant is Taiwan's deaf community?
Well, of course, you cannot separate language and culture. And so you can't learn ASL without learning about deaf culture. And since my experience, first of all, having Taiwanese students come to America in my classes, that was my beginning. I learned about the Taiwanese culture. But then when I came to Taiwan, one of my first persons that I met was Mr. Yushan Ku. And I've been following his work over the years, and he's an extraordinary example of how a deaf leader can bring together the deaf community to really make an impact. I saw that, especially with his galvanizing of the deaf community to lead a protest to have TSL included in the 2019 National Languages Act, which in the beginning did not want to include it. And Mr. Ku followed in the footsteps of what happened in America's deaf community, and that is the protest of 1988, when the deaf students said, we want a deaf president, and the board said no. So they shut down the school for a week. Since then, we've had 4 deaf presidents. To answer your question, the vibrancy of both communities are really remarkable.
We're, of course, talking about Fang Huai's father here.
My interest in working with the deaf community is in the development of bilingual storybooks in TSL and Chinese or American Sign Language in English, with my American colleagues back in the U.S. The deaf community and the deaf culture becomes a very important part in our development of these materials.
Could you elaborate on that? I know we'll be talking more about education, of course, but could you maybe give us some examples of how culture is integrated into these teaching materials?
Well, deaf people have their own stories, and a lot of their stories have to be or involved growing up in a hearing world and the conflicts they experience. So if you can capture those stories and show them to children, they can learn how to cope in a hearing world. For example, one of my children's books that I wrote when I was a teacher was a comic book that illustrated a little deaf boy who was having problems in his school, getting in episodes and fights with his friends and not doing his homework. And so I wrote that story based on the stories that the children would come back and tell me in the classroom. So I was incorporating deaf ideas and deaf cultural stories into stories that I could then help them to read in English.
You've mentioned coping. What are some of the main challenges that deaf kids in this world experience?
Well, our society is very autist. That's a word we use, meaning it's very hearing-centered.
Autist as in A-U-D-I-S-T.
Right. An autist meaning that the auditory sense is valued much higher than the visual sense. It's what you hear and communication using spoken language. A deaf person is primarily visual, and so they have barriers, and these barriers start from a very early age in learning how to communicate with hearing people that aren't aware of their being deaf. And because deafness is an invisible condition, with a blind person, you see they might have a cane or glasses. A physically challenged person, you see them in a wheelchair. It's very clear. And so the non-disabled person has a chance to react because they have that information. With a deaf person, it's invisible. And so there's a lot of myths and misunderstandings about deaf people, like they're not as intelligent as hearing people, or they can all lip read, or they all can read. These kinds of barriers, a deaf person is constantly having to prove themselves that they can fit in. And this creates a big burden for deaf people. They have to deal with this burden all their lives.
And do you feel like, from what you've observed and researched, these contexts are similar here in Taiwan and back in the U.S.?
Yes, very similar.
So Fang Huai did mention that you are here to attend a conference organized by the Taiwan Association of Sign Language Interpreters. Within that conference, you gave a presentation on deaf people within medical and legal settings. Could you please share with us some of the key takeaways from that presentation?
Yes. Well, as I mentioned before, I'm a teacher, educator of deaf children and adults, and I'm not an interpreter, although I am fluent in sign language. One of my jobs is to be a deaf education expert who provides information to the legal system, helping the legal situation understand the linguistic background of a deaf person. The linguistic background of a deaf person is very important because it determines what accommodations they need, like a sign language interpreter. And what we find in the U.S., and also I've learned it happens here in Taiwan too, is that a deaf person might go to a doctor and they will not be provided with a sign language interpreter to talk about their condition. The doctor might want to use written notes, and the deaf person might not have good reading skills and writing skills. Or the doctor and the nurse might want to use a family member to be an interpreter, and that puts them in an emotional situation, which is not very helpful.
Right.
And usually these can end up in a lawsuit, like in a civil case where a deaf person will sue for damages, because it's very harmful for a deaf person to have to experience this. And so what I do is a linguistic evaluation of the deaf person to show the court that their English skills, in my case, America, are not strong enough for them to do with writing or signing consent forms. And their sign language skills are such they've been using sign for many years. They went to a deaf school. That's their preferred communication. And by law in America, the American with Disabilities Act, the doctor's office has to provide that, the sign language interpreter. And many doctors don't know that. Mm. But this also happens in law enforcement, where a deaf person might be arrested. They don't know why they're arrested, and they might be handcuffed, put in a squad car, taken to jail, and fingerprinted. They're not provided an interpreter. The person questioning them is using spoken language or putting a form in front of them and they can't read it. And so that's a big problem in the United States, too, is not providing interpreters in police stations and with law enforcement. Now, we're doing a better job with providing interpreters in court situations. Court language is very abstract, and judges and lawyers are more open to providing that. And judges and lawyers are familiar with the laws, whereas at the police station and doctors are not as familiar. This is a big problem in the U.S. still, and it's surprising in this 21st century. I was talking to one of my colleagues, and he is deaf and works as an interpreter with his hearing wife, who's also an interpreter, and he was helping a deaf patient with a case with a doctor. So I think Taiwan might be doing a pretty good job with providing interpreters if they can find them. I know there is a shortage of qualified interpreters.
And you did pose a very relevant question in the beginning when you just entered the studio, whether or not our show is accessible to deaf or hard of hearing people. I have to admit our show is not really accessible because this is an audio show, and even on YouTube, we often fail to provide proper transcripts for people to read. But as we know, even transcripts don't necessarily mean accessibility for deaf people specifically, right?
Well, you hit the word access. That's what deaf people want. They want access to information, and they don't get it, and they don't get access to language as young children. That's the big struggle.
Now, on this show, we often talk about language contexts, right? Especially the deprivation of language, the language loss, when it comes to, ethnic groups or ethnic minorities, as to say. So a lot of our listeners will be familiar with these contexts. What would be different in the context of sign language and deaf people for our audience to understand when thinking about this problem?
Deaf people often consider themselves members of a minority group, hearing society being the majority, deaf being the minority. So there are similarities. But the two languages, spoken language and sign language, they operate in different modalities, and that's a real important concept that's often overlooked. Spoken is auditory oral, sign language is visual gestural. So, in a podcast like this, where a deaf person might want to have access to it, reading the print, they will miss my body language your body language and your facial expressions. They will miss a lot of discourse, markers that provide a lot of meaning. Even in the deaf community, there are minorities within the minorities. There's Black deaf, Hispanic deaf, Native American, and they have some of their own cultural features that are different than the white deaf communities. That has gotten more research recently, especially at Gallaudet University, that has actually departments that are all show those different areas, and they're doing a lot of publications on that.
Oh, wow. That's very interesting. I do have a lot of follow-up questions, but I won't because we need to close this part. I do have one final question for you. What has your experience been like with Taiwan Sign Language? And during your third visit now, have you been able to pick up some signs, let's say?
Well, I have prepared. Before I came, when I was invited to come and I was planning my trip and my lectures, I asked one of my colleagues to put me in contact with a TSL tutor. So every Sunday morning at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m., I get up and turn on my Google Meet, and there is my sign language instructor with his wife, and they have been tutoring me for 8 months. My goal, of course, was not to become an interpreter, but to have some social language. I have picked up signing TSL there. Yesterday, I was over at the university, and I sat in on a TSL class. And last night, I had a delightful 2.5 hours at a Deaf Association club meeting, and they put up with my sign, and I think they appreciated my efforts. And so it's been really has enhanced my experience coming. My tutor was Chinese and deaf, and but he's fluent in ASL too.
Oh, wow.
He spent 3 years over here at Gallaudet in the United States. So he was teaching me TSL through ASL. And then his wife, who is hearing and has some spoken English, would often say, now come on, go back to TSL. That was a very interesting experience to learn TSL through my second language, ASL.
Oh, wow, that's so complicated, though.
Actually, it's very easy because he would sign the ASL and then sign the TSL after each other, so I would go back and forth. In the beginning, it was visual overload, but after a while, I was able to do it. There are many similarities, but very distinct differences, and I think Feng Guam might have mentioned those in his podcast. The TSL belongs to the Japanese Sign Language family. ASL really has its roots in French Sign Language. But there's some very similarities like directionality and use of classifiers, certain linguistic features. And the grammar has similarities but differences. Another similarity is the use of facial expression to code grammar and the use of body language and positioning. So I had already knew those in ASL, so I was able to use that to learn in TSL.
Well, thank you so much for this short intro to a topic that's more interesting to language nerds, myself included. With that, we've run towards the end of our airtime for today, but we do not end our chat with Dr. Andrews here. Join us next week as we continue our conversation about sign language and deaf education. Thank you, Dr. Andrews, and thank you everyone for tuning in.